The hospital hallway smelled faintly of antiseptic and something warmer, like coffee that had been sitting too long. It was just past dawn, that quiet hour when the night shift was tired and the day shift had not fully found its rhythm yet. The lights hummed softly above, casting a pale glow over the polished floors. Ion stood near the nurse's station, gently adjusting the sleeves of his uniform. It was only his third week on the job. Everything still felt new, the sounds, the pace, the responsibility. He kept checking his notes, making sure he hadn't forgotten anything. Even small tasks felt important to him. He didn't want to make mistakes. Some of the more experienced nurses moved around him with ease. They spoke quickly, laughed quietly, and handled things with a confidence he admired. Ion stayed mostly silent, observing, learning. He didn't mind being the quiet one. He believed that if he listened carefully enough, he would become better. A senior nurse passed by and gave him a brief nod. "Stay sharp today," she said. "We're expecting a few high-priority cases." He nodded quickly. "Yes, I will." But inside, his chest tightened just a little. High-priority cases meant pressure. And pressure meant he would have to trust himself more than ever. He took a slow breath and looked around the emergency ward. Monitors beeped softly in the distance. A patient coughed somewhere behind a curtain. A trolley rolled past him, wheels squeaking slightly. It all felt overwhelming, yet strangely calm at the same time. He reminded himself why he was here. He remembered long nights studying, his hands trembling before exams, the way his family had looked at him with quiet pride when he finally graduated. This job wasn't just work. It was something he had fought for, something he had promised himself he would do well. Still, the doubts crept in. Was he fast enough? Was he skilled enough? Would he freeze when something serious happened? He shook his head slightly, pushing those thoughts away. There was no room for hesitation here. Just then, the sliding doors at the end of the hallway burst open. 2 paramedics rushed in, pushing a stretcher with urgency. Their faces were tense, their movements sharp. The calm atmosphere shifted instantly, like a switch had been flipped. "Emergency incoming," one of them called out. Ion's heart jumped. The patient on the stretcher was an older man, his face pale, his breathing uneven. His chest rose and fell in short, strained movements. There was something about him, something that felt different, important, though Ion couldn't explain why. A doctor stepped forward immediately, giving quick instructions. "Get him to Bay 3. Monitor vitals. Move." The team moved quickly, and Ion found himself stepping forward without thinking. The room stayed quiet after the director asked his question. No one moved right away. The soft beeping of the monitor filled the space, steady and calm, almost as if it were trying to remind everyone what truly mattered. Alira stood still, her hands resting lightly at her sides. She could feel the weight of every eye in the room, but she didn't look away. There was no point in pretending or softening what had already been done. "Yes," she repeated gently. "I made the decision." The director studied her for a long moment. His face was controlled, unreadable, the kind of expression that revealed nothing and everything at the same time. Behind him, the senior doctor stood with crossed arms and tight jaws, clearly waiting for what would come next. "You understand the protocol," the director said at last. "I do," Alira answered. "And you chose to ignore it." Alira hesitated for just a second, choosing her words carefully. "I chose to respond to what I was seeing." That answer didn't sit well in the room. One of the doctors let out a quiet breath of frustration. Another shook his head slightly, as if disappointed but not surprised. "This isn't about interpretation," the doctor said. "There are procedures for a reason." Alira nodded slowly. "I know. But sometimes the situation doesn't follow the procedure exactly." The director's gaze sharpened. "And you decided you knew better than the entire team?" The question wasn't loud, but it carried enough weight to make the room feel even smaller. Alira didn't rush to answer. She looked briefly at the patient, noticing the steadiness in his breathing again, the small but real improvement that had started after her decision. It gave her just enough strength to speak honestly. "I didn't think about being better," she said quietly. "I thought about helping him." For a moment, no one spoke. The words were simple, but they landed differently than anything else she had said. Still, the silence that followed wasn't comforting. It felt like a pause before something inevitable. The director turned slightly toward the monitor, observing the stable readings. There was no denying that the patient's condition had improved. It was clear to anyone who looked. But instead of softening the situation, that fact seemed to make it more complicated. "You got lucky," one of the doctors said, breaking the silence. "That doesn't make it right." Alira didn't respond to that. She knew there was no point arguing. From their perspective, rules were what kept everything safe. Breaking them, even for the right reasons, created risks they weren't willing to accept. The director straightened, his attention fully back on her. "This hospital doesn't operate on instincts alone," he said firmly. "We have systems, approvals, and accountability. When one person decides to step outside that structure, it affects everyone." Alira felt her chest tighten slightly, but she stayed calm. "I understand that. Do you?" he asked. The question wasn't meant to invite an answer. It was a statement in disguise. The director took a slow breath, as if weighing his next words carefully. When he spoke again, his voice was steady, but there was a finality to it that couldn't be missed. "What you did cannot be overlooked," he said. Alira felt those words settle in her chest. She had expected this, in a way. Still, hearing it out loud made everything more real. "You put yourself in a position that goes beyond your role," the director continued. "And regardless of the outcome, that is not something we can allow." The room remained still, almost frozen in that moment. Alira lowered her gaze slightly, not out of shame, but out of quiet acceptance. She had made her choice. This was the result. "I see," she said softly. The director nodded once, as if that was all he needed to hear. "Effective immediately," he said. "You are relieved of your duties here." The words were clear. There was no anger in them, no raised voice. Just a decision, firm and unchangeable. For a brief second, everything around Alira seemed to fade. The sounds, the movement, even the presence of the others, it all felt distant. Not because she was shocked, but because something inside her had gone very still. She had helped a patient, and this was the price. One of the staff members shifted uncomfortably. Another looked down, avoiding her eyes. No one stepped forward. No one spoke in her defense. It wasn't that they didn't feel anything. It was that this moment didn't leave space for it. Alira took a slow breath and nodded. "Understood," she said. Her voice didn't shake. That seemed to catch someone off guard, though no one said it out loud. The director gave a small, final nod, then turned his attention back to the team, already moving forward as if the situation had been resolved. To him, it likely had. But for Alira, it was only just beginning. She stepped back from the patient's bedside, her eyes lingering for a moment on his face. He looked more stable now, more at peace than he had earlier. It was a small comfort, but it mattered. "Take care of him," she said quietly, though no one responded directly. Then she turned and walked toward the door. Each step felt heavier than the last, not because she regretted what she had done, but because she was leaving behind something she had built with time, effort, and quiet dedication. The hallway outside felt different now. The same walls, the same lights, the same distant sounds, but everything seemed slightly colder, more distant. People moved past her, some glancing briefly, others pretending not to notice at all. Word had already started to spread. She could feel it in the way conversations paused as she passed, in the way eyes followed her for just a second longer than usual. No one said anything directly, but the silence spoke enough. Alira kept walking. She reached the small locker area where she kept her belongings. The space was quiet, empty except for the faint echo of her footsteps. For a moment, she just stood there, looking at the locker door. It didn't feel real. Then, slowly, she opened it. Inside were the simple things she brought with her every day. A folded scarf, a small notebook, a pen she always used, and a photo tucked into the corner. She picked it up gently. It was an old picture, slightly worn at the edges. Nothing special to anyone else, but it reminded her of why she had chosen this path. of the belief that small actions could matter more than big titles. She held it for a moment longer, then placed it carefully into her bag. One by one, she gathered the rest of her things. There wasn't much, but each item felt heavier now, filled with meaning that hadn't been there before. As she closed the locker, a quiet voice spoke behind her. "You didn't deserve that." Alira turned slightly. It was one of the younger staff members, someone who had been in the room earlier but hadn't said anything. Their expression was uncertain, almost hesitant. Alira gave a small, gentle smile. "It's okay," she said. "But you helped him," the person said, their voice low. "Everyone saw it." Alira nodded. "That's enough for me." The words surprised even her a little, but they felt true. The staff member looked like they wanted to say more, but didn't. After a moment, they gave a small nod and stepped back. Alira adjusted the strap of her bag and took one last look around. There was no dramatic goodbye, no final speech. Just a quiet understanding that this chapter of her life had ended. She walked down the hallway toward the exit, each step steady, even if her heart felt heavier than before. As she reached the main doors, she paused for a brief second. What if things had gone differently? The thought crossed her mind, but she didn't let it stay long, because deep down she knew, if she were faced with the same moment again, she would make the same choice. She pushed the door open and stepped outside. The air felt different, fresher, but also uncertain. The world beyond the hospital continued as it always did, unaware of what had just happened inside those walls. Alira stood there for a moment, holding her bag, unsure of what came next. All she knew was that she had done what she believed was right, and now she had to live with everything that came after. Alira stood just outside the hospital doors, her bag resting against her shoulder, her thoughts still trying to settle. The world outside felt strangely normal. Cars passed by, people walked in and out, and somewhere in the distance, a vendor called out to someone. It was as if nothing had changed. Yet for her, everything had. She took a few slow steps forward, unsure where she was supposed to go next. There was no plan in her mind, no clear direction. Just a quiet space where questions kept forming and fading before she could answer them. Maybe I'll just walk for a bit, she thought. Sometimes walking helped her think. Sometimes it helped her not think at all. She had barely made it a few steps down the path when a low, distant sound reached her ears. At first, it blended into the background noise of the city. But within seconds it grew louder, deeper, more focused. Alira paused. The sound didn't belong to the usual rhythm of the street. It was heavier, cutting through everything else with a steady, powerful beat. Other people noticed it too. A few heads turned upward. Someone near the entrance stepped outside, shielding their eyes as they looked toward the sky. The sound continued to grow, filling the air in a way that made it impossible to ignore. Alira looked up. First, she saw nothing, just open sky, pale and wide. Then, slowly, a dark shape appeared in the distance, moving quickly, becoming clearer with each passing second. A helicopter. Not just any helicopter. It had a distinct presence, strong, precise, unmistakable. Its movement was controlled, purposeful, as if it knew exactly where it was going. The sound of its blades echoed across the hospital grounds, drawing more attention. People began to gather near the entrance, their curiosity pulling them closer. Conversations started in low voices, filled with questions no one could answer yet. "Is that for the general?" someone whispered. "Maybe something urgent," another replied. Alira remained still, watching. She didn't feel panic or excitement, just a quiet sense of confusion. The situation didn't seem connected to her anymore. She had already stepped out of that world, or so she thought. The helicopter circled once, lowering its height gradually. The wind from its blades began to push against the ground, lifting dust and small bits of debris into the air. The noise became almost overwhelming, forcing people to step back or cover their ears. Hospital staff rushed outside, trying to manage the sudden arrival. Security moved quickly, guiding people away from the landing area. Alira instinctively stepped back as well, her eyes still fixed on the aircraft. It descended smoothly, landing in the open space near the hospital entrance. The moment it touched the ground, the atmosphere shifted again. More focused, more serious. The blades continued to spin as the side door opened. Two uniformed officers stepped out first. Their movements were sharp and confident, their presence commanding attention without needing to say a word. Behind them, another figure followed, carrying a folder and scanning the area carefully. The crowd fell quieter. Even the whispers softened, replaced by a kind of respectful silence. Alira watched from a short distance, unsure why she couldn't look away. The officers spoke briefly to the hospital security team, their conversation quick and direct. Then one of them looked toward the building, as if searching for something or someone. A moment later, his gaze shifted and landed on her. Alira felt a slight tension in her chest. It didn't make sense. There were many people standing nearby. There was no reason for him to focus on her. But he did. He said something to the others, too low for anyone else to hear. The second officer followed his gaze, then nodded. Without hesitation, they began walking toward her. The distance between them closed quickly. Alira's mind raced, trying to understand what was happening. Had something gone wrong inside? Was there another emergency? Or was this just a misunderstanding? She adjusted her grip on her bag, standing still as they approached. When they stopped in front of her, the first officer spoke. "Are you Alira?" he asked. His voice was calm but firm, the kind that expected a clear answer. "Yes," she replied, her voice steady despite the confusion building inside her. The officers exchanged a brief glance, then looked back at her. "We need you to come with us," the second one said. The words didn't make sense at first. "Come with you," Alira repeated softly. "Yes," the first officer confirmed. Immediately, a ripple moved through the crowd behind them. People leaned in slightly, trying to hear more, trying to understand what was happening. Alira glanced briefly toward the hospital doors. Just minutes ago, she had been told to leave. Now, these officers were asking her to return, or perhaps go somewhere else entirely. "I think there might be some mistake," she said gently. "I don't. There's no mistake," the officer interrupted, not harshly, but with certainty. "We've been instructed to find you." Alira's heart began to beat faster. "Instructed by who?" she asked. The officers didn't answer right away. Instead, the second one opened the folder he was carrying and checked something quickly. Then he closed it again and met her eyes. "That information will be explained," he said. "But we need to move now." The urgency in his tone wasn't aggressive. It was controlled, purposeful, carried the weight of something important, something that couldn't wait. Alira felt a dozen questions rise in her mind all at once. Why her? What had changed? What did this have to do with the patient? Behind the officers, more hospital staff had gathered. Some of them recognized her, their expressions shifting from curiosity to disbelief. One of the nurses whispered, "They're asking for her?" Another replied, "But she was just..." The sentence trailed off unfinished. Alira could feel their eyes on her again, just like before. But this time, the feeling was different. It wasn't judgment. It was something closer to surprise. She took a slow breath. "I just left," she said quietly, almost to herself. "They told me to go." The first officer's expression didn't change, but his voice softened slightly. "That's not relevant right now," he said. "What matters is that you're needed." The words settled heavily in the air. Needed. Alira looked at him carefully, trying to read something in his expression. Some clue that would explain everything. But there was nothing to read. Just focus, urgency, and a clear expectation. She glanced once more at the helicopter, its blades still turning, ready to lift again at any moment. Everything felt unreal. A few minutes ago, she had been walking away with no direction. Now, she was standing in front of a military helicopter, being asked to step into something she didn't understand. What if this changes everything again? She thought. But another thought followed, quieter but stronger. What if this is connected to what you did? Her gaze drifted back toward the hospital for a brief second. Inside those walls, she had made a choice. A difficult one. A risky one. And now, somehow, something had shifted because of it. She looked back at the officers. "If I come with you," she said slowly, "will someone explain what's happening?" "Yes," the second officer replied. "You have our word." Alira studied their faces for a moment longer. There was no hesitation in them. No doubt. Just certainty. She nodded once. "All right," she said. The officers stepped slightly to the side, giving her space to move forward. As she walked with them, the crowd parted quietly. No one tried to stop her. No one spoke. They simply watched. Each step toward the helicopter felt heavier than the last. Not because she was afraid, but because she didn't know where those steps would lead. The wind from the blades grew stronger as they approached, pulling at her clothes, making it harder to hear anything clearly. One of the officers gestured toward the open door. "Careful," he said. Alira nodded, holding onto the side as she stepped up. Inside, the space was compact but organized, filled with equipment and seats designed for purpose, not comfort. She sat where they indicated, her bag still in her hands. The door closed behind her with a solid, final sound. Outside, the world blurred slightly through the small window as the blades picked up speed. Alira looked out one last time. The hospital stood there, unchanged from the outside, even though everything inside it had shifted for her. People were still gathered near the entrance, their faces small and distant now. For a brief moment, she wondered what they were thinking. Then the helicopter lifted. The ground moved away beneath her, the distance growing quickly. Alira sat still, her hands resting tightly together, her mind filled with questions that had no answers yet. She didn't know where she was going. She didn't know why she had been chosen. All she knew was that something had changed. And whatever it was, it had only just begun. The helicopter rose steadily into the sky, the ground shrinking beneath it until the hospital became just another building among many. Alira sat near the side, her hands still resting on her bag, her thoughts moving faster than she could organize them. The inside of the aircraft was calm in a controlled way. The sound of the rotors was strong but steady, almost rhythmic. The two officers sat across from her, focused and silent, as if this kind of journey was normal for them. No one spoke for a while. Alira kept looking out the small window. The city stretched beneath them. Roads like thin lines, vehicles like moving dots, people too small to recognize. It was strange how quickly everything could feel distant, even moments that had just happened. Only a short time ago, she had been standing outside the hospital doors with nothing but uncertainty in front of her. Now she was flying above it all, being taken somewhere without a clear explanation. Finally, after a long silence, Alira spoke softly. "Where are we going?" The officer sitting closest to her turned slightly. His expression remained serious, but there was less tension in his voice now. "A secure medical facility," he said. Alira nodded slowly, though that didn't answer the real question in her mind. "And why?" she asked gently. "I was just a hospital worker. I don't understand why I'm being taken like this." The officer looked at her for a moment, as if deciding how much to say. "You were requested directly," he said. "Requested?" Alira repeated. "Yes." She waited for more, but he didn't continue. The silence returned, heavier than before. Alira leaned back slightly, her gaze dropping to her hands. Her mind kept replaying everything that had happened in the hospital. The patient, the monitors, the decision she made, and the moment the director dismissed her. Still didn't feel real. She had expected consequences, yes, but not something like this. Not helicopters. Not officers. Not urgency that treated her like she was part of something far bigger than her job. Her thoughts were interrupted when the second officer finally spoke, his voice quieter than before. "The patient you treated earlier," he said. Alira looked up immediately. "Yes," she replied. "He is under protected status," the officer continued. Alira frowned slightly. "Protected status?" The officer nodded once. "High-level military designation. His condition and recovery are matters of national importance." Alira's breath slowed as she processed the words. national importance. That phrase alone made everything feel heavier. She looked out the window again, trying to understand how a decision she made inside a hospital room could possibly connect to something that large. "I didn't know," she said honestly. "We know," the officer replied. "That's why you're here." Alira turned back toward him. "Because I helped him?" The officer didn't answer directly, but his silence felt like confirmation. The helicopter shifted slightly as it moved through the air, adjusting its path. The motion was smooth, but Alira felt a small tension in her chest. Not fear exactly, more like the awareness that something was unfolding without her full understanding. After a few minutes, the first officer spoke again. "You acted without authorization," he said. Alira nodded slowly. "Yes, but the outcome was positive," he added. "I think so," she said quietly. "It was," he confirmed. That simple statement made her pause. She had been prepared to accept criticism, even punishment. But hearing that her decision had actually helped felt different. Not relief exactly, something more complicated. Validation, mixed with confusion. The officer continued. "The standard protocol would not have adjusted in time," he said. "Your intervention prevented a critical delay." Alira listened carefully, her attention fully focused now. "I didn't know all of that," she said. "I just saw something wasn't right." "That's what we were informed," the second officer replied. Alira looked between them. "So, I did something good, but I broke rules doing it." The first officer gave a slight nod. "That is one way to put it." A faint, almost tired smile appeared on Alira's face for a moment, but it didn't last long. "Back at the hospital," she said softly. "They didn't see it that way." The officers exchanged a brief look. "We are aware," the second one said. Alira leaned back again, her eyes drifting to the window. Clouds passed beneath them now, soft and white, moving slowly compared to the speed of everything else. "It felt simple at the time," she said quietly. "Just paying attention. That's all I thought I was doing." The first officer nodded slightly. "Simple decisions often carry complex outcomes," he said. Alira didn't respond, but she understood what he meant. After a while, the helicopter began to descend. The city below changed gradually as they approached a different area. More structured, more secure. Buildings were spaced differently here, with clear boundaries and restricted zones. Alira could sense it even before she saw the landing site. The aircraft lowered smoothly toward a secured open space surrounded by controlled access points. Personnel in uniform were already waiting. As the helicopter touched down, the noise of the blades slowed slightly, then stabilized as they prepared for landing procedures. Alira watched through the window as people moved into position outside. The door opened, and the officers stepped out first, followed by Alira. The air outside felt different, cleaner, sharper, more controlled. Everything had a sense of order that was immediate and unmistakable. Alira adjusted her bag and followed the officers across the landing area. Several people observed her as she passed, but no one stopped her. They entered a nearby building through a secure entrance. Inside, the atmosphere was quiet and professional. The walls were plain, the lighting bright but soft, and the hallways clean and precise. It felt less like a hospital and more like a facility built for purpose. Alira was guided through a corridor and asked to wait in a small room. The officers left briefly, leaving her alone. She sat down slowly. For the first time since leaving the hospital, she had a moment to fully process everything. Her mind replayed the sequence again, her decision, the director's reaction, the helicopter, the officers, and now this place. It still didn't fit together neatly. She looked down at her hands. "I just helped a patient," she thought again. "Why does it feel like I stepped into something much bigger?" A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. The door opened, and one of the officers returned. "Follow me," he said. Alira stood up immediately. They walked down another corridor, this one longer and quieter. At the end of it was a large room with glass panels and advanced monitoring equipment. Several professionals were inside, focused on screens and reports. But what caught Alira's attention wasn't the equipment. It was the atmosphere. There was a sense of anticipation in the room, as if something important was about to be discussed. At the center stood a man in formal uniform. His posture was straight, his presence calm but strong. When he turned, his eyes immediately settled on Alira. The room seemed to quiet even further. The officer who brought her in stepped aside. "Sir," he said briefly. The man nodded once, then stepped forward slightly. "Alira," he said. She straightened instinctively. "Yes." He studied her for a moment before speaking again. "We have reviewed what occurred at the hospital," he said. Alira waited. "And we have confirmed the impact of your actions." The words were careful, measured. Alira felt a small tightening in her chest. Impact. That word again. The man continued. "You were not part of the assigned medical chain of command," he said. "However, your decision produced a result that stabilized a critical situation." Alira nodded slowly. "I understand I broke procedure," she said. "Yes," he replied. "You did." Pause followed. Then he added, "But you also acted in a moment where hesitation could have led to failure." Alira didn't know what to say to that. The room remained quiet. The man took a step closer. "Because of this," he said, "you have been requested here for evaluation and acknowledgement." Alira blinked slightly. "Acknowledgement?" she repeated softly. "Yes." Her mind struggled to catch up. She had expected consequences, maybe questions, maybe even restrictions. But acknowledgement wasn't something she had prepared for. The man studied her reaction carefully. "You showed independent judgment under pressure," he said. "That is rare." Alira lowered her gaze slightly. "I just did what I thought was right," she said. The man nodded. "And that is exactly why you are here." Alira slowly looked up again. There was something in his tone now that felt different. Not cold, not formal, but thoughtful. "You are not dismissed as a worker who disobeyed rules," he said. "You are being considered as someone who acted when others did not." Alira felt a quiet shift inside her. Not relief, not joy, something closer to confusion mixed with understanding. She had left the hospital thinking she had lost everything. But now, standing in this place, hearing these words, she wasn't sure what she had actually lost or gained. The man stepped back slightly. "There will be further discussion," he said. "For now, you will remain here." Alira nodded slowly. "All right," she said softly. As she stood there, the reality of her situation settled in more deeply. Nothing about her life had returned to normal. In fact, it seemed like normal had ended entirely the moment she chose to trust what she saw instead of what she was told. And somewhere beyond the glass walls of the room, systems were already moving, quietly, deliberately, toward decisions she had not yet been told about. Alira didn't know what came next, but she understood one thing clearly now. What had happened in that hospital room was only the beginning. Alira stood quietly in the center of the secure facility room, still trying to settle her thoughts after everything she had heard. The words from the officer and the senior figure echoed in her mind, especially one simple idea that refused to fade. Acknowledgement. It didn't feel real. Not after what had happened at the hospital. Not after being dismissed in front of everyone like she had crossed a line that couldn't be forgiven. She had walked out thinking her story had ended there. But now, standing in this controlled, unfamiliar place, it felt like her story had simply changed direction instead of ending. The room around her remained calm. Screens displayed medical data, charts, and reports she didn't fully understand. People moved with quiet precision, speaking in low voices, focused on tasks that seemed far beyond her level. No one ignored her presence, but no one treated her like she belonged here either. She was somewhere in between. A door opened again, and the senior officer entered. His expression was steady, but there was a slight shift in his demeanor compared to before. It wasn't colder or warmer, just more thoughtful. "Alira," he said. She straightened slightly. "Yes." He gestured toward a chair. "Sit." She hesitated for only a second before sitting down. The room felt slightly smaller once she was seated, as if the weight of what was about to be said had increased. The officer stood a few steps away, folding his hands behind his back. We have completed a full review of the events at the hospital, he began. Alira nodded but stayed silent. Your actions were outside protocol, he continued. That fact is not being ignored. She listened carefully, her hands resting still in her lap. But, he added after a brief pause, the outcome of your decision changed the trajectory of a critical case. Alira looked up slightly, unsure how to respond. The officer continued. The patient you assisted is not an ordinary case. His condition carries significance beyond a single facility. Delays in treatment would have created serious complications at a national level. Alira absorbed the words slowly. She had known the patient was important, but hearing it described like this made it feel heavier than before. Not just important in rank, but important in consequence. I didn't know all of that, she said softly. We understand, the officer replied. And that is part of why your decision is being reviewed differently. Alira looked down for a moment, then back up. So what happens now? She asked. The officer studied her for a moment before answering. That depends, he said. The room became even quieter. On what? She asked. On whether your actions were a one-time response, he said, or a reflection of how you think under pressure. Alira blinked slightly. I don't understand. The officer stepped a little closer. You did not wait for authority, he said. You observed, assessed, and acted. Alira nodded slowly. Yes, that combination, he continued, is both dangerous and valuable. The words lingered in the air. Alira had never been described that way before. Dangerous and valuable in the same sentence. I didn't try to break rules, she said quietly. I just saw something wrong. The officer nodded once. And you chose action over hesitation. Pause followed. Then he said something that made her sit a little straighter. Most people hesitate too long, he said. In situations like that, hesitation is often more harmful than action. Alira didn't respond immediately. She thought about the hospital again, about the monitors, about the patient's condition, about the moment she had decided to trust what she saw instead of what she was told. It had felt simple then. It didn't feel simple anymore. The officer continued. You were dismissed from your position, he said.